Yes, our God is a mountain mover, and you know what? He's still moving mountains every day. And the good news is He can move your mountains too. Hi there, this is Chuck Cooper, host of It's a God Thing radio program. Thank you for joining us today. We sure are glad you're here. You're about to listen to some awesome interviews with believers in Jesus Christ who will tell you how God has revealed and proved Himself to them by moving mountains they were unable to move by themselves. They say that their stories can only be described as a God thing. Ready for a real blessing? Alrighty then, let's do this God thing. Well, we're sitting here today in the office of Dr. Ernest Easley. Dr. Easley is a pastor of Roswell Street Baptist Church in Marietta, Georgia. And at age 40, he was a pastor out in Odessa, Texas. And in 1988, he heard what all of us dread to hear. His doctor dropped the C word on him. Dr. Easley, we want to welcome you to the program today. Tell us about that day in the doctor's office and how you responded to that.
Well, let me back up about a week.
Okay, sure.
I was out in East Texas doing a one-day revival at a church, and my whole family was there, which was very unusual. And I got up that morning to get ready for worship, started to take a shower and shave. And when I started to shave, I realized that I had a knot underneath my jaw, a lymph node, which I'd never had before, and it caught me by surprise. And
sure.
My first thought was I've just got an infection of some sort. But I finished the revival that day, and then I headed back to Odessa. And that following week, I realized that it was getting bigger, not smaller.
Oh.
So I went to my doctor, and he said, let me send you to an ENT and let him look at it.
Sure.
So about a week later, I went to see the ENT, and he examined it, and he looked at it, and he said, let's do this. Let's take some needle biopsies out of it. When you hear the word biopsy.
Yes.
Well, the word needle's bad enough.
Right.
Okay. But when they tack on biopsy after the needle,
right.
I remember thinking, I had just a real sick feeling. He's taking a biopsy out of this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so he left the room, and nurse came in, and she came back in about 10 minutes, and I'm telling you, she had the longest needles I've ever seen in my life.
Oh, boy.
I mean, they were, 14 inches.
Good.
And I'm thinking, it's a little long, a little
right.
excessive, don't you think? But anyway, they took 5 biopsies out of that lymph node in my neck, and they would penetrate it and then draw something out of it, and a little deeper and so forth. And that was not an enjoyable experience in itself. But he looked at it and he said, it looks like to me just an infection of some sort. He said, let me run it to the lab. This is on a Friday. He said, I'll call you Monday with the results. And so I went back, preached that Sunday morning, Sunday night. And Monday, a little after lunch, I got a phone call from the doctor's office. And he said, I would like for you to come in at 4 o'clock this afternoon for us to go over the results. Well, Chuck, let me tell you this, that whenever the doctor's office calls you,
yes,
and they're asking you to come in to give you a report on the results, that's a tip-off.
Yes, it is.
Okay. So I thought about it. I thought, I better call my wife, which I did. And she said, well, I need to come with you.
Sure.
2 sets of ears are better than 1.
Absolutely.
So she did. And I'll never forget walking in that doctor's office that day. I knew something was up when I walked in, and all the nurses at the desk, none of them would look me in the eye.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay, and they all knew who I was.
Yeah.
Okay. And I thought, that's kind of an odd thing. I mean, I'm usually talking to people, greeting people, and
sure.
so forth. So anyway, we sat down there, and a few minutes later, they called our name, and they walked us into an examination room and said the doctor would be here in just a moment. So I'm in the examination chair, and my wife's sitting on my left up against the wall in a chair. We were just sitting there waiting. And the doctor came through, and he had a chart in his hands, and he didn't look me in the eye either. He immediately sat down at a desk that was right there in the room with us, opened up the chart, and he said, Mr. Easley, he said, we've got the results back on the biopsies. He said, it's not good news. And I said, well, what does that mean? He said, well, somewhere in your body, you've got a fast-growing malignant cancer.
Oh, my goodness.
Chuck, I wish I could sit here and tell you that that when I got that word, I thought, well, we'll be fine, and God will get us through it, and it'll be fine. But I didn't respond that way. In fact, he stood up, started talking to me, the doctor, and I realized he was talking, and I couldn't hear him. And I remember putting my hand up, and I said, "Stop talking. I can't hear you." I could see through his lips him saying, "You're going into shock."
Ooh.
So he laid me back down in the chair and put a wet rag on my head. And he said, "I'll be back later." So there I sat in shock, passing out. My wife sitting in there. We're alone in that room, and neither one of us are speaking. We were both in total shock of the news that the doctor had just given us.
I could only imagine.
Well, let me tell you, a lot of times people play this game. If it were me, how would I respond?
Yes.
I think everybody's played that game at some time in their life. If the doctor told me I had cancer, how would I respond? Well,
I'm playing it right now, sir.
well, let me save you a lot of effort.
Okay.
Don't even try to play the game,
Okay.
because there's no way in the world you can emotionally get into that situation in a pretend scenario.
Yeah.
Because how it is in reality is different than what you think it's going to be. Or you can't create that in your mind if it's not a reality. So we sat there and trying to emotionally, spiritually, psychologically deal with this horrible news that we just got. So 15, 20 minutes pass maybe. The doctor comes back in. He sits me back up. He said, can we talk now? And I said, sure. He said, you've got a fast-growing malignant cancer somewhere in your body. He said, my suggestion is that we put you to sleep and do an exploratory surgery. It's somewhere in your head and neck area. And I'll go in and do some biopsies out of your esophagus, your mouth, your tongue, anything that it looks like it's a possibility that the primary source could be. And let's see if we can find the primary source of it. I said, okay. He said, when can we do this? He said, how about tomorrow morning?
Gosh.
He said, it's growing so rapidly. He said, we don't have time to waste. So the next morning I was in surgery. And I remember coming out of surgery, and I remember Julie, my wife, over me saying, they found it and they got it.
Oh, good.
Well, I'm thinking, hey, this is a short chapter.
Yeah.
They found it and they got it.
Got it.
So they went on to explain to me that my right tonsil was the primary source. So they removed the tonsil. So I'm thinking, well, this is over.
That's it.
And he said, you need to be back in my office tomorrow and let's talk about what we need to do next. I'm thinking, what's there to talk about? You found it, you got it, it's over. Well, the next day, I was recovering from my tonsil being removed, which is not a very comfortable situation in itself. I always was told if you're going to lose your tonsils, do it when you're a kid. It's a lot less painful. I agree. It was a very sore throat feeling, obviously. But the next day I was in his office and he said, though we found the primary source and have removed it, there are still cancer cells probably in the tissue. Because there's no way that I can know for sure, and there's no way I can get every cell. And all it takes is one cell in there. And I said, well, what do we do now? He said, well, my recommendation is that we have another surgery and we open you up ear to ear and remove all the lymph nodes, all the muscles, your voice box if it looks suspicious, in order to try to save your life. Now that's the quote.
That's tough news.
That is the quote. That's exactly what he said to me. And I was really obviously taken back by all that. Now he's talking about a radical surgery that would, number one, leave me deformed, leave me silent, trying to save my life. Julie and I went home and talked about it and made a few phone calls with some folks. I decided that I was going to get a second opinion. I called the doctor and said, I'd like to do this. He said, where would you like to go? I said, I think I'd like to go to MD Anderson in Houston, which is probably one of the most renowned cancer centers in the world.
Right.
They're right on the cutting edge of cancer research and have a great reputation. So I had 5 days before we went to Houston. And Julie and I loaded up our car in Odessa to get ready for the 9-hour drive down to Houston. And, Chuck, I remember We had things in the car. We were about to leave, and it'd been very difficult for me to have any time alone with all the people in the community and the church, and basically nobody could get to me because my wife made sure nobody could get to me, and they were trying to shield me from people and so forth. But I found enough time to get off by myself in the backyard of our home, and I stood in the back and I prayed. And I'll never forget this scene. It's etched in my mind forever. I'm up out there, and I've got my hands raised to the heavens. I've got tears streaming down my face. And I remember saying a prayer something like this: Lord, I don't understand why this is happening, and I don't have to understand. But I praise you for it, because I know that nothing can come to me except that comes through you. And I know that somehow through this, whether I live or die, it's going to be for your glory and for my good. That's the essence of the prayer. And so we went down to Houston.
Did you have a peace at that time out in your backyard garden?
I had a peace in the sense that I knew that God was sovereign and that He had a plan, and that whatever it was good. So we went back to Odessa, and I shared with our church that I was leaving to go to Houston for 3 months. And I didn't know how the church would respond. But if you ever want to talk to a church about how to deal with a crisis when the pastor has one, that church is a great example of how to do it. Not only did they send us to MD Anderson, they made sure we stayed right across the street at the best location. They gave me a check of $20,000 for incidentals.
Goodness me.
They would fly our children down to Houston every other weekend to see me.
Oh, boy.
I mean, they stood behind their pastor. We moved to Houston. We started the 44 radiation treatments.
Were you able to speak?
I spoke for a few weeks.
Okay.
After radiation's a funny thing. First 2 weeks, actually, it's the first 12 days you feel pretty normal. I remember telling me that on the 13th day it'll hit you. Day 13, I'm thinking,
Yeah.
whatever. But 13th day, it did hit me, and I went downhill very quickly. 44 radiation treatments are very damaging to you. I was on all kind of pain medications for the damage that the radiation was causing. In fact, I had second and third degree burns on the outside of my neck.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, they're burning you alive, trying to kill the stuff in you. I lost 15 pounds in 5 days. And so they insisted in putting a feeding tube in. And that's a story in itself. But I finally gave in and said, okay, let's do it. Because I was dying of malnutrition. I couldn't swallow enough nutrition to get enough in me to sustain my weight. So they put a feeding tube in, which I had for 6 months. It took me that long to be able to swallow enough food to get enough calories per day. I lost 44 pounds in probably 5 weeks. And so, I mean, you're rapidly going downhill quickly. But, 44 radiation treatments it really is devastating. It destroyed my saliva glands, which are still destroyed to this day. They work maybe 10%, if that. My taste, I didn't have any taste for a year. My taste buds probably work about 80% now, which I'm grateful for. Eating is still a challenge after 12 years. I have to wash every bite down because none of the muscles in my throat work. The things that you do without even thinking, you chew, you swallow, you don't even think about it. Well, for me, it is a major issue to get food down my esophagus because none of the muscles that allow you to swallow, none of mine work because they're cooked. Everything in your throat is very limber and flexible. Well, mine's cooked. So nothing works in my throat. So it's a real challenge for me to eat and swallow even to this day. But, 3 months of that, and then I was able to get back to Odessa. Probably another 2.5 months I slowly began to try to preach again. And it was a very slow, gradual thing. Fatigue was the last hurdle that I had to get over. I was exhausted doing anything. It took me a long time to get off the pain medication. It took me over a year to get off of it. They had me on some very strong drugs to keep things comfortable for me. And then, I'm very sympathetic toward people that become addicted to pain medication, prescription drugs, because I know how easy it is to get on them. I know how hard it is to get off of them. So that's a challenge. It was a challenge in itself.
Thanks, Dr. Easley. We're going to take a short break from your incredible story to give you a chance to catch your breath. But right now, I want to encourage our local listeners to seriously consider joining our G93 radioactive corps of volunteers. You see, Dr. Larry has asked me to volunteer to serve as coordinator of volunteers here at WUC G93.1 Community Radio. We have lots of fun, family-oriented, community-wide activities scheduled in the next several months, and we need local volunteers to assist us. Here's how you can help us by volunteering a couple hours each week. We need folks of all ages to represent us at the Saturday Farmers Market each week. We need some folks to maintain our Facebook pages. We need a volunteer or two to help find barter businesses. We need both males and females to record some announcements for us. We need a handyman around the station, and we desperately need someone to develop a station brochure. And we'd love to have several high school or college students interested in learning the radio business to volunteer to do a variety of things around the station, including the possibility of recording announcements for us. If you're interested, or if you want more information, please contact me at itsagodthingradio@hotmail.com. That's itsagodthingradio@hotmail.com. Or you can contact Dr. Larry at WUCG931@windstream.net. Now, let's get back to Dr. Easley. I have a couple of questions for you, Ernest. Obviously, you were called to preach. And what was going through your mind about this call that you had received while you were recuperating?
That's a great question, Chuck. I was at a conference soon after that. I was sitting at a table, and a preacher buddy of mine came and he knelt down beside me. He hadn't seen me until, before all this happened. And he said, "Hey, let me ask you something." He said, "How in the world did you feel thinking that you'd never preach again?"
Yeah.
And I looked at him and I said, "You know what? It was the least of my concerns." I said, "I was just trying to live. I wasn't even concerned about preaching again. I was just wanting to be able to see my children grow up."
Sure.
And my thought was this. The preaching call was not my call to start with. Mine was a response to God's call in my life. I didn't initiate it. I didn't ask for it. I didn't even want it. And God called me to do it, and I responded by saying yes to Him. And I just figured that, number one, if I was going to live and I somehow couldn't preach it, He would find another avenue of ministry for me to communicate His Word. I mean, there's more than just the oral expression, the declaration of God's Word that communicates it.
Yes, it is.
So I figured I'm either going to get strong enough to preach again, or God will create another avenue, venue for me to communicate His Word, or I'm going to heaven. So I knew either way it was going to be okay. But, I think that people just need to realize that for a pastor, a preacher, I do what I do in response to God's call in my life. What I do is an act of obedience to Him. And it initiated with me, it initiated with Him, so I was okay either way.
I've got a final question, Dr. Easley, and we undoubtedly have listeners that are listening to you right now, experiencing, they've been diagnosed with cancer, or they have loved ones who have, or friends who have. What advice would you give to, based on your experience, what advice would you give to those type of people?
Well, there's several things, Chuck. Number one, I would say this. be aggressive, meaning don't let the grass grow under your feet. You need to see a doctor. You don't need to waste time. Be aggressive in the steps that you're taking to try to get a solution to this. That's one thing. And these are not in priority, by the way.
Okay.
A second thought would be, James in the New Testament says, the prayer of a righteous man accomplishes much. I would enlist every righteous person I knew. See, when I was sick, I didn't want just anybody praying for me. I wanted righteous people praying for me.
Absolutely.
So seek righteous people to pray for you, people that are in right standing with God, people that have a testimony and a walk that supports and backs up what they say. And begin to enlist people to pray for you. Seeking medical attention, I think, is important. Get the best care you can possibly get. Third thought is, get a second opinion. Over these last 12 years, I've dealt with a lot of cancer patients that have come across my path. And I always encourage them to get a second opinion. Had I not got a second opinion, you and I probably wouldn't be having this visit right now. Not that I could possibly not have lived, but as radical as a procedure that the doctor had planned to do on me, with the possibility of removing a voice box, this conversation would be very tainted. Okay?
Sure.
One thing I learned through this is that every day is a gift from God. Sometimes we moan and we fuss through a day and complain about circumstances, but the truth of the matter is, every day really is a gift from God. And when we see it as a gift from God, our perspective changes, and then how we deal with the issues of each day changes drastically. So there's 4 or 5 things off the top of my head that I would suggest for people that either are discovering they've got some type of a cancer, or if you've got a family or a loved one that has a cancer.
Well, Dr. Easley, I want to thank you so much for your willingness to share this story. And I thought of another question before we sign off. How has your faith changed since this happened to you?
Well, I think that my faith is deepened. You know, Chuck, one thing, whenever you go through a life-threatening situation like that, you never are the same on the other side of it.
Yes.
You can't be. I think that how I see life, what I once thought perhaps was important, really isn't all that important in the big scope of things. Things that used to irritate me, get me upset, really don't impact me much like they used to. I've kidded around saying everybody ought to have cancer once, because it'll make you a nicer person out of you.
Oh my goodness, I bet.
So I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy.
Right.
But you come out of it different, and I think better. I had an old preacher tell me one time, he said, you know, when you go through a crisis, it will either make you bitter or bigger, depending on how you respond to it. And so, you know, you just got to decide, hey, how am I going to respond to this? Am I going to be a bitter person? I could be a bitter person today.
Sure you could.
Okay. Every time I try to eat, swallow, I'm up during the night having to get something to drink, so I have no moisture. I choke on my food all the time. I have a hard time physically. I could be a bitter person, but because I chose early on that was not an option for me, this is going to make me a better person, it has.
Well, Dr. Easley, thank you so much again for sharing your personal story. It's going to be an encouragement to a lot of folks.
Well, we're grateful to be able to have a story to tell, and I'm grateful that God still heals, that God is sovereign. He has a plan for every life, mine, yours, everybody, those of you that are listening, and the key is to follow Him. Seek Him and follow Him, and He'll correct your paths.
That's scripture.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Wow, what a great half hour this has been. Tune in next time for more great God Thing stories, and tell all your friends to tune in too. Oh yeah, one more thing. If you or someone you know has a verifiable story which needs to be told, please email a brief summary to us at mystory@itsagodthingradio.com. That's my story, all one word, at itsagodthingradio.com. See you next time.